So now we turn to the second essay in Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. This one is titled Guilt, Bad Conscience, and the Like. He begins this essay by saying, to breed an animal with the right to make promises. To breed an animal with the right to make promises. Is not this the paradoxical task that nature has set itself in the case of man? Is it not the real problem regarding man? So there's a lot that could be said unpacking just that first statement, to breed an animal with the right to make promises. But what Nietzsche, in his unpacking of that, what he means, of course, is in a sense kind of what this second essay is about. But what it serves to do is explain how in the first essay we saw the origin of our morals dating back to that, what he called the slave revolt in morality, and that the way in which that slave revolt worked was based on ressentiment, this desire to get rid of that which is other. So it's not an embracing of the self, but instead it's a rejection of the outside. Now Nietzsche is going to explain what exactly is the cause of this kind of morality which is exclusionary, and why ultimately it is nihilistic, why it is basically a drive towards extinction even of itself, why it is, as he calls it, a form of bad conscience revolving around a guilt which can never be overcome. So we see where Nietzsche says what he explains is the birth of responsibility and the birth of conscience. So he says for the birth of responsibility that human beings have a sense of responsibility because this is largely due to the existence of society, that society presupposes some kind of a regularity where human beings, of course, follow customs and try not to violate taboos and things like that, but which is, of course, coupled with a certain kind of free will, because only those who have a choice, of course, to not do those things have a responsibility. There is no responsibility required for beings which are entirely determined. And so it's this paradox then, which goes back to that first quote about the breeding an animal with the right to make promises, which really troubles the whole setup of humankind. He says, man must himself, first of all, have become calculable, regular, necessary, even in his own image of himself, if he is able to stand security for his own future, which is what one who promises does. So we have this kind of base human nature, which of course is this kind of complete freedom that we can do what we like, but at the same time we can't, because we live in a society which determines, which kind of boxes us in what it is we're supposed to do, right? So this is, of course, part of the birth of not any specific moral values, but the structure of morality itself. Then the birth of conscience, he says, is where a free being possesses both an unbreakable will, but also their own measure of value. So he says, the proud awareness of the extraordinary privilege of responsibility, the consciousness of this rare freedom, this power over oneself and over fate, has in his case penetrated to the profoundest depths and become instinct, the dominating instinct. What will he call this dominating instinct, supposing he feels the need to give it a name? The answer is beyond doubt. This sovereign man calls it his conscience. So not only then, of course, for customs and rules and laws, ultimately, of a society to work, to have power, they must be internalized. And the only way they can be internalized, Nietzsche says, is the development of a conscience, where one says, I know better, right? I know I shouldn't have done that. Where it doesn't just require one always punishing someone else when they don't do it, but instead it's the development of this sense of what one ought to do according to then that responsibility. That then conscience sort of undergirds then responsibility. Because without conscience, one would not feel the need necessarily to live up to what one is responsible for. If one doesn't have a conscience, one doesn't care if they don't meet their obligations or not. And in that case, then one cannot make promises, one can't plan for the future, and there can then be no civilization. Now, conscience, of course, is a good thing in that it makes possible civilization, it makes possible promises, it makes possible all sorts of wonderful things that human beings can accomplish. But what Nietzsche is saying is that, as we'll see, it is the slave revolt and morality, that embracing of ressentiment, which is based on a bad conscience, based on this guilt which can never be done away with. So he says, in a certain sense, the whole of asceticism belongs here. That a few ideas are to be rendered inextinguishable, ever-present, unforgettable, fixed, with the aim of hypnotizing the entire nervous and intellectual system with these fixed ideas. And ascetic modes of life are means of freeing these ideas from the competition of all other ideas, so as to make them unforgettable. The worse man's memory has been, the more fearful has been the appearance of his customs. The severity of the penal code provides an especially significant measure of the degree of effort needed to overcome forgetfulness and to impose a few primitive demands of social existence as present realities upon these slaves of momentary affect and desire. So, as we talked about in that last video lecture, Nietzsche is very critical of religion and its promotion of ideals which are transcendental, and then he's equally critical of philosophy too, because philosophy, it's not just religion with ideals of some kind of eternal sense of justice or some being which is true and which ultimately then will punish you for doing what is truly wrong. But philosophy too seeks these transcendental ideas. Take, for example, in the case of Kant and the categorical imperative, where it is something universal which all human beings then have the ability to understand and operate according to, because we all then possess reason. What does that do? Well, it basically attempts, and Kant kind of admits this as much, it nullifies the world. Because Kant says himself, you cannot incorporate any empirical concerns. You can't incorporate happiness. You can't incorporate anything having to do with your actual existence into morality. What is right and what is wrong. There's nothing more which can mold and further complicate this paradoxical nature of humanity than these moral ideas itself, which seek to be totalizing. Because that is what these ascetic ideals seek to do, Nietzsche is saying. That is why asceticism is so powerful, because it seeks to go beyond simple customs of any society, because it internalizes then in human beings this sense of a conscience. Now, this sense of a conscience is something, of course, which is necessary. The problem is, when Nietzsche praises the master morality of nobility and strength and a kind of a domination, it's not a domination which seeks to make everyone do exactly what that person does. Because it is, for Nietzsche, it's an embracing of the different. So that's something really interesting about him, where although he is not a democratic philosopher and doesn't think everyone is equal or should be equal, he does promote actual, for him, what would be true freedom and a true ability to create for yourself your own ideas. And so we start to see this problem then with nihilism creeping in here with aesthetic ideals and the problem of, again, what he calls slave morality, so the morality we all kind of inhabit now. Because what it seeks to do then is say, well, whatever is correct for me must be correct for everyone else. And everyone must then abide by that because it is something that is supposed to be, as he says, unforgettable and fixed. Again, as he says, with the aim of hypnotizing the entire nervous and intellectual system with these fixed ideas. Things which can never be then done away with. So, where does guilt come into play? Because there can be no discussion of morality without guilt. Because guilt is always that thing which, if something truly is good, if it's what you ought to do, well, whenever you don't do it, then you are guilty because you have not done it. One might seek, as the philosophers have done, to find the origin of guilt based on some, again, transcendental concept which seeks to explain for all time why it is that guilt exists and the role it plays in morality. Maybe we could see, like in the case of Hume, that maybe guilt exists because it seeks to make us be more benevolent towards others because we in turn find it pleasurable or useful or whatever. Nietzsche, of course, is going to do genealogy. He's going to look back at what he would say is the historical record then of guilt, and he does so again with the etymology of the word guilt. And he finds that the word guilt actually has its origin in the very material concept of debt, and specifically then in the creditor-debtor relationship. That relationship between one who gives one something else, and so then they owe it back in return. Justice, then, has its origin in this creditor-debtor relationship. So it's not, again, something that would have its origin in, some transcendental thing which has always existed throughout all time, which was either commanded by God, if we were to take, divine command theory. It's not something which has always existed throughout time in this thing called pure reason, in the case of Kant. Instead, Nietzsche says, the idea, now so obvious, apparently so natural, even unavoidable, that had to serve as the explanation of how the sense of justice ever appeared on earth. The criminal deserves punishment because he could have acted differently. So going back then to, of course, conscience and responsibility and this possession of the will. This is, Nietzsche says, in fact, an extremely late and subtle form of human judgment and inference. That this argument, then, that guilt is based on free will and not doing what we ought to do, notice how that's already this internalization of a norm. So then, if we were to say that is the cause of guilt, then we would be doing the same thing that the English psychologists tried to do with the origination of morals, where they basically snuck in moral values and then said, well, yes, these were have always been good and people naturally recognize them as good. Well, that's no actual historical explanation at all. It just is someone looking around at the present and saying, well, this is how things are, so this is how things always have been. For Nietzsche, again, no. We can look at the use of words throughout history and we can see the way in which they change. So this, of course, goes back to when he talked about the distinction between the master or ancient morality and then the slave morality. Because guilt, then, truly has its origin in the word debt. I can't remember off the top of my head the German word that he mentions for the origin of this word debt. I think it might be schlecht. I'm not entirely sure. But the importance of this, though, is that it shows, again, these concepts are historical. They're rooted in the world itself. They're not something that is eternal. To try to come up with a theory of justice and to try to associate it with the institution of law, with the existence of a government. These things only actually, then Nietzsche says, come after the institution of law. He says, to speak of just or unjust in itself is quite senseless. In itself, of course, no injury, assault, exploitation, destruction can be unjust, since life operates essentially, that is, in its basic functions, through injury, assault, exploitation, destruction, and simply cannot be thought of at all without this character. And this is at a very important point in Nietzsche's philosophy, that life necessarily is violent. You cannot avoid it. And that even, to go back to the first video lecture and that first essay we discussed, even when that Christian morality says it's based on love and forgiveness, Nietzsche tried to argue it says that, but that's a justification that is only after the fact. And its origin is in revenge. Its origin is in a kind of violence, then, of getting back at the upper classes which oppress, then, the lower classes. He gives an example of all the different explanations that people give for, the origin and justification, then, of, for example, punishment. So I want to read, then, this example. This starts on page 80 and it goes to 81. There's a lot here, so I won't read the whole thing, but he says, to give at least an idea of how certain, how supplemental, how accidental the meaning of punishment is, and how one and the same procedure can be employed, interpreted, adapted to ends that differ fundamentally, I set down here the pattern that has emerged from consideration of relatively few chance instances I have noted. So here are these examples that try to give an account of the justification of punishment that is supposed to be the true, eternal, necessary, essential case of why punishment exists. Punishment as a means of rendering harmless, of preventing further harm. Punishment as recompense to the injured party for the harm done, rendered in any form. Punishment as a kind of repayment for the advantages the criminal has enjoyed hitherto. Punishment as the expulsion of a degenerate element. Punishment as a festival, namely as the rape and mockery of a final defeated enemy. Punishment as the making of a memory, whether for him who suffers the punishment, so-called improvement, or for those who witness its execution. Punishment as payment of a fee stipulated by the power that protects the wrongdoer from the excesses of revenge. Punishment as a compromise with revenge in its natural state when the latter is still maintained and claimed as a privilege by powerful clans. Punishment as a declaration of war. And a war measure against an enemy of peace, of the law, of order, of the authorities, whom as a danger to the community, as one who has broken the contract that defines the conditions under which it exists, as a rebel, a traitor, and breaker of the peace, one opposes with the means of war. So he says, it is clear that punishment is overdetermined by utilities of all kinds. So his claim, then, is that all these people that try to give an account of the history of the origins of these concepts don't actually go back far enough. And that when he says punishment is overdetermined, that morality is overdetermined, justice is overdetermined, what he means is that these things, the actual origin of them, has become so normalized and forgotten then, that throughout time, there's been a multitude of meaning ascribed to these things that do exist at certain cases in time, but never are the true origin of these concepts. And we can see that another example he gives is that after the establishment of law and then the slave revolt and morality, the law and justice become an eternal ideal. That after civilization progresses and it becomes more successful, more peaceful, more profitable, the standard of living raises, that justice no longer is something partial. It's no longer something that's done just because the sovereign, the king, wants to punish those who are his enemies for the sake of them being enemies, or just to punish some poor person just because he can. But instead, Nietzsche says, In the long run, it thus attains the reverse of that which is desired by all revenge, that is fastened exclusively to the viewpoint of the person injured. From now on, the eye is trained to an ever more impersonal evaluation of the deed, and this applies even to the eye of the injured person himself. And so we saw this in the case of Aristotle, in the case of John Rawls, in the case of Robert Nozick, in the case of Kant, that justice must, of course, if it is to be rational, if it is to be true, if it is to be right, it must be something impartial. It must be something which is universal, which applies in all cases at all times. Nietzsche is saying that idea of justice is something which comes late in history. Only once basically only once a power structure has become successful enough that it no longer has to worry about doing things which might hurt the existence of itself as an institution. And so again, keep in mind, all these cases, Nietzsche is trying to show the ways in which the concepts we think are, capital T true, are just lowercase t truths. That there are different truths that exist in different times. And none of them are the transcendental, real, eternal truth. So the origin then of guilt and punishment, he says, lie worlds apart. That these previous historians of morals, seek out some purpose in punishment, for example, revenge or deterrence, and then they guilelessly place this purpose at the beginning as the cause of the origin of punishment. So what one must do then, if they are truly want to seek the origin of our moral prejudices, and the origin then of guilt, they must distinguish that which he says is enduring, which is the custom, the act, or a certain strict sequence of procedures, which would be then the existence of, take prison, the existence of a law, because these have always existed, of course, in different forms, but it's been an enduring custom that societies have laws, societies have taboos, and things like that. That must be distinguished then from that which is fluid, which then is the meaning which can be overdetermined, that purpose or the expectation associated with the performance. And so he says, today it is impossible to say for certain why people are really punished. All concepts in which the entire process is semiotically concentrated elude definition. That only that which has no history is definable. That's something really problematic, right? And I mentioned in the first video lecture that Nietzsche said to take a hammer to philosophy. That statement right there is taking a hammer to philosophy, that only that which has no history is definable. Because what he's saying then is, you can't ever really say what truly is the good. You can't ever say what truly is punishment or justice if you can't give a definition for it. And if you can give a definition for it, then he's saying it means it's not historical, because things change over time necessarily. That would mean then everything philosophy says is truly the good, is truly what justice is. These are no more than fairy tales, because they don't at all in any way relate to the real world. And that is a really damning argument against the whole purpose of philosophy. So going back then to the ressentiment and this hatred then of the upper class, the nobility, those who have power, and those who are strong. Ressentiment is based, then Nietzsche says, in bad conscience. So he says that the origin of punishment is on behalf of the one wronged. That punishment is simply, there is no justification for it, as with all the philosophers or historians want to give. Instead, punishment is just a result of self-gratification that we can see, he says, in history. That because it goes back to the creditor-debtor relationship, that Nietzsche says, when the creditor punishes the debtor for not being able to pay back their debts, They're not punished because there's supposed to be some truly thing that, that the debtor has done which is wrong, but instead the creditor does it because it makes them feel good, right? They're not going to get back their money or whatever it is they loaned out, and so they punish because it's a form of self-gratification, nothing more. On the other hand, Nietzsche says that then with the slave revolt in morality, punishment takes on an eternal significance, as where in the historical case, the origin of punishment, since it has its roots in the creditor-debtor relationship, is not something where the debtor has committed some eternal evil, which they must ask forgiveness for God or something like that. Instead, it's something which is done away with, right? Once the creditor has punished, has maybe beaten, or eye for an eye, right, taken from the debtor, it's done. The debtor is no longer in debt. Instead, with the slave revolt of morality, with this rise of Christian morality, Nietzsche says that punishment takes on an eternal significance, that the only possibility that an original wrong then can be righted by oneself. He says punishment cannot be righted by oneself. He says punishment is supposed to possess the value of awakening the feeling of guilt in the guilty person, that one seeks in it the actual instrumentum of that psychical reaction called bad conscience, the sting of conscience. And so bad conscience is a result of the internalization of man. And he says, thus it was that man first developed what was later called his soul. That again, this idea that there is a soul and that you are guilty and it's a mark on your soul which is eternal and that only God can forgive this evil which you have done, this wrong. That is something, again, which develops later. These are justifications which come along and graft themselves, basically, onto already existing practices. There's a big problem, then, with this bad conscience, because if it is something which cannot be righted by oneself, it can't be righted by paying back the debt one has incurred. Well, how do you overcome this guilt? How do you overcome this debt? So here Nietzsche looks back at ancient practices and ancient ancestral worship. And for Nietzsche, he tries to show that the origin of guilt and this creditor-debtor relationship is really a relationship between a society's present generation and its ancestors. So the story goes like this, Nietzsche says. You have ancestor worship, which is prevalent among all societies in human history up until, of course, a certain level of civilization. And then you get the rise in more monotheistic religions, which we'll mention in a moment. But the reason this exists is, for Nietzsche, that there is the present existence of oneself is only made possible based on previous generations and what they have done. So, every person born into a society is thrown into a society with debts. Debts of a certain burden which must be paid back through ancestor worship, through maybe sacrifices or other types of rituals. So one must pay back then these sacrifices, not only debts, not only with sacrifices, but other accomplishments as well, like ways in which you improve society. And then you, of course, by doing so, pay back that debt to your ancestors. But then you also credit future inhabitants of that society. That means then there's this eternal recurrence then of debts and paying it off, and then them becoming the creditors, and then new people being born and needing then to make sacrifices and further accomplishments to pay back then the debts of their ancestors. These debts then, and these spirits, of course, never cease as long as human civilization continues. They can never be paid back in the long run. They can individually, of course, be paid back. Instead, they only increase in proportion to the progress of civilization. This is not something that is nihilistic in itself, because each society has the possibility that it can pay back its debts. It's just civilization as a whole can't pay back these debts because it only exists based on the existence of its ancestors, right? But there's nothing about a current society which says that its debt is so large it can never pay it back. That is, until, for Nietzsche, the advent of the Christian God. And this is, again, part of Nietzsche's atheism, I guess, but he's also critical of contemporary atheism as well, and I'll mention that in a moment. But for Nietzsche, it is the advent of the Christian God that he says is the maximum God attained so far, because it is a God which is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, most importantly, all-loving. And therefore, this God accompanies then the maximum feeling of guilty indebtedness on earth. He says, the irredeemable debt gives rise to the conception of irredeemable penance, the idea that it cannot be discharged, that it is therefore eternal punishment. And this is necessarily in Christianity for Nietzsche because of original sin. This is something which every single human being, according to Christianity, is born with, original sin, of which you yourself can never pay back that debt. It doesn't matter what you do. Instead, Nietzsche says, God himself sacrifices himself for the guilt of mankind. God himself makes payment to himself, that God being the creditor then, and humans being the debtors. There is no paying back to the creditor that humans can do. Instead, God is the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. The creditor then sacrifices himself for his debtor. Why? Out of love. Out of love for his debtor. That's something amazing for Nietzsche, because what it says is, God, yes, says, I can forgive your debt. I can forgive that original sin, that guilt which inhabits you. But I do so out of love. Does that really mean you, once forgiven, are truly debt-free? For Nietzsche, no. Because that means you owe an unpayable amount of thanks then to God for paying back your debt, for forgiving you. And here we start to see the slippery road towards nihilism, and why this ressentiment, this bad conscience of our current morality is so dangerous for Nietzsche. Because it is a morality which says all are necessarily at base evil. That human beings naturally are born of sin. There's nothing we can do ultimately to pay this back. And instead, this then seeks to neutralize all differences among human beings, to equalize ourselves, because truly no one then is better than anyone else. And that for Nietzsche is then nihilism, this saying everything is the same. Everything is as good as everything else. So again, conscience is simply that necessary feeling of responsibility to meet a promise by utilizing this antagonism of animal instincts and then this denial of those animal instincts, because at the, one and the same time, we have feelings of pleasure we want to fulfill and so on, but we also use society to kind of combat that with rules where we try to regulate ourselves. Bad conscience is a turning responsibility into an unworthy burden, which can only be rectified once the world is completely denied. Once, by denying the world is meant denying all change, by denying all value. a literal turning of the will against itself, Nietzsche says, the will to nothingness. That bad conscience, what our morality is based on a will to nothingness, a will for no differences among anyone. The man of bad conscience, Nietzsche says, apprehends in God the ultimate antithesis of his own ineluctable animal instincts. He reinterprets these animal instincts themselves as a form of guilt before God, as hostility, rebellion, insurrection against the Lord, the Father, the primal ancestor and origin of the world. Can anything save us from this nihilism? Nietzsche alludes to the Übermensch, the Superman, the one who rises above them, who reevaluates our values. Nietzsche alludes to this person, who would be then Zarathustra, at the end of the second essay here. And I'll read a little bit of what he says. So I'm going to read the last paragraph on 96 and then go into the little bit of section 25. So it says, is this even possible today, this overcoming of ourselves? But someday in a stronger age than this decaying, self-doubting present, he must yet come to us, the redeeming man of great love and contempt, the creative spirit whose compelling strength will not let him rest in any aloofness or any beyond, whose isolation is misunderstood by the people as if it were flight from reality, while it is only his absorption, immersion, penetration into reality, so that when he one day emerges again into the light, he may bring home the redemption of this reality, its redemption from the curse that the hitherto reigning ideal has laid upon it. This man of the future who will redeem us not only from the hitherto reigning ideal, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. This bell stroke of noon and of the great decision that liberates the will again and restores its goal to the earth and his hope to man. This antichrist and anti-nihilist, this victor over God and nothingness. He must come one day. But what am I saying? Enough, enough. At this point it behooves me only to be silent, or I shall usurp that to which only one younger, heavier with future, and stronger than I has a right, that to which only Zarathustra has a right, Zarathustra the godless. It's at this point that I would, of course, if we were meeting face to face, I would have us read the short essay, The Parable of the Madman, where Nietzsche famously says, God is dead. And in that parable, what he argues is that, well, there's this part where this madman kind of runs into this marketplace, and he says, whither is God? I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How did we drink up the sea? How did we wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from all suns? Where are we moving? Backward, forward? We don't know. All these different directions. God is dead. We have killed him. God remains dead. And then all the strangers around him look like, what in the world is this person saying? God is dead and we have killed him. And then the madman says, alas, I've come too early. You all are not yet ready to accept that you have killed God. And what Nietzsche means by that is, of course, humans haven't literally killed God. But what he's saying is that we've outgrown, based on this will to nothingness, we have outgrown the need for God. And instead, we basically continue this practice without actually, we continue this practice through our secularization, where we think we don't need rituals, where we think we can get to these eternal ideals, which are divorced from the world. And in that, Nietzsche thinks we necessarily strive towards this negation of ourselves as a species which can achieve great things. Nietzsche is a philosopher of greatness. He thinks that what is good is that which takes risk, is that which risks everything, including your life. And instead, he thinks that this move to kind of make the world safe, to make it so that we all live longer, so that we're all equal, that is this denigration of humanity and the world and the greatness of the world. And until we realize that even atheism, in its search for these transcendental ideals about, why we can use reason to determine everything, until we realize that too is nothing other than this continuation of the will to nothingness that inhabits Christian morality, Nietzsche thinks that we are doomed then to continue down this road of nihilism. So at this point, I guess I have a discussion question I'm interested in. Do you think that there really is this problem, as Nietzsche thinks, of this kind of move to make things safe, of this move to make everyone equal? Is that a problem, right? Will we lose all sense of value and greatness and ultimately joy and happiness, where things become mundane? Or do we need actually a kind of a battle over values, as again, that saying Nietzsche, said that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, that we should embrace suffering and accept that suffering is a part of life. Do you think Nietzsche's right about that, or no, we should actually work to this impartial view of justice, that we should, work towards this consistent application of morality that says, if it's wrong for me to make an exception for myself, as Kant says, that then it's wrong for everyone, and that we should all abide by the same rules. I likely assume, of course, you're going to say that no, Nietzsche is wrong about that. We should strive for an impartial form of justice. We should strive for a consistent kind of morality which works towards equality. Nietzsche would say, well, of course you're going to say that because you're operating according to our current set of values. Is it possible to look beyond our own values to even answer that kind of a question? I'll leave that up for you all to decide.